Picture it. Miami International Airport, 2015. I was being pushed in a wheelchair with my 2-week-old son in my hands, in my arms, and my 3-year-old clutching his favorite Ninja Turtle, Michelangelo. My eldest, who was then 7, had already left Miami with his grandmother 2 weeks prior. Armed with $50 in my pocket, 15 years of memories, and a true knowing that God had ordered my steps, I took the biggest leap of faith and I relocated to New York City, and I loved it. Returning to New York City would be a chance for me to raise my children and to take my love of jewelry design to another level in a city and a place that I loved. The interesting thing about that is that I had no home. You see, just based on a word from God, I had moved my kids, my 3 kids and myself, to one of the most expensive cities in the United States without a clue as to where we were moving to. I mean, I knew that we were going to be spending some time with my uncle and his family in their home until I found a home, but as to how long that was going to be, I had no clue. As to where I was going to get the money from to pay for the home, I had no clue. But again, armed with my $50 and a word from God, I took the leap of faith. So it was in that tiny, very tiny living room that had now doubled as a bedroom for my 3 kids and myself that I realized that shelter that is commonly known or thought of as a physical space can actually be something tangible, intangible. It can be an emotion, it can be a feeling. Shelter can be the warm hug or the warm smile of a relative just at the time when you think that all is lost. Shelter can also be that verse of scripture written on the side of a reusable shopping bag that reminds you that God has promised that he'd strengthen you and he'd be with you wherever you go. A shelter covers, it protects. After about 3 months of being in that living room, by a miracle of God, we were able to move out and into someplace else that we thought was going to be, or we hoped was going to be at least our home for 5 years. That, however, didn't work that way. 2 years later, and 1 divorce, 2 years and 1 divorce later, I found myself and my kids once more without a shelter, the physical type. But I knew that God had said he would never leave me nor forsake me, and so I kept searching. So after 3 months, we found that place, we moved in, we realized that that wasn't going to be. And when we actually, after the divorce, it was a complete change in our lifestyle because the kids would not have had any more piano lessons, they wouldn't have martial arts lessons, they wouldn't have music lessons. It was going to be a change in our lifestyles. And after looking and looking for a while, I finally met a gentleman who had an illegal basement to rent that he offered to rent me. There were two catches, however. Number one, it was being rented more than the market value of a legal basement. And number two, I had to move in with no furniture. Because it was illegal, he says I couldn't move in with any furniture. I would only have access to a few things that were in the apartment, inclusive of 2 inflatable beds. So I'm sure someone tonight might be thinking, why? Like, why would you even consider that? My simple answer to that one is because I needed shelter for my 3 small kids. I remember in that basement, one of my proudest memories in that basement was when I launched my fine jewelry brand, Suzanne Dunn Jewelry. I remember the excitement. I remember the excitement when I pressed that go live button on the website. And I also remember a tremendous feeling of gratitude. Gratitude to that shelter, gratitude to that basement, because it was there that I had grown. It was there that God had hidden me and he had stretched me at times when I thought I would have broken, but I didn't. It was in that basement, that shelter, that I was a dream. I was able to give birth to a dream that the world had many times tried to abort. But it's here, though, that I should remind you of that old saying that says, be careful of what you ask for. For the 3 years that we had been there, every week I would go out looking for an apartment. But because of New York City and a lot of red tape and just their ridiculous renting requirements, I could never seem to meet it. And also coming from a one-income household, I just couldn't afford it. And so that's when I decided to pray the craziest prayer of my life. And that was, Lord, by any means necessary, get us out of here. And he heard and he answered. So one Sunday morning, there was a flood. There was a flood in the basement, a mysterious flood in the basement that took us to a hotel for 3 nights. And while I was there, the landlord sent me a text and he said, well, unfortunately, you're not able to return because of the extensive damage. So here I am. In 3 days, I lost my shelter and I'm now officially homeless in New York City with 3 small children. Shelter, a temporary place that offers protection from danger and bad temperature, bad weather. I remember the day that we moved into the New York City housing shelter. It was a day that I'd never forget. We arrived at the processing center about 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. And after being moved from office to office and filling out hundreds of papers and answering hundreds of questions, I remember the overwhelming feeling of loss and disappointment in myself. What was happening? How could this have happened to me? What was I doing? And more so, what was I doing to my kids? But I remembered that God had told me to trust him. And so I took a deep breath and I trusted him. And after what felt like an eternity, we were then assigned a unit, a home. But it was in the Bronx. The Bronx? My kids go to school in Brooklyn. I work in Brooklyn. Was there nothing closer? All right, no problem, Suzanne. Trust the process, trust the process. So then I remember the drive to the apartment. That was crazy. It was a 20-minute drive that felt like it was taking for hours. And then there were the questions. Would there be another family living in the unit? Was there going to be the word shelter on the door? Were my kids going to be safe? Was somebody going to say the word shelter around my kids? The 20-minute drive was torture. We finally got to the apartment. Well, we finally got to the family shelter, the apartment, about 3 a.m. And the representative, he opened the door, flicked the hallway light on, and then it happened. After 3 years of sleeping on mattresses on the floor, 3 years of me promising my kids beds and rooms, 3 years of me feeling disappointed in myself as a mother, as a provider, I exhaled. As we moved further in the apartment, I saw 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, and they had beds. My kids would be able to sleep in beds after 3 years. God had heard my prayer and he had answered. I must say, though, that gratitude didn't last for long. I put my kids to bed, and then while I was laying in my bed, I was sobbing and just fighting back fears or fighting back feelings of disappointment and loss and embarrassment and grief and fear. Fear of the future, fear of what people would say when they heard what I had allowed to happen to myself and my kids. And I must have fallen asleep at some point because my 6-year-old came running into the room screaming, "Mom, it's snowing! Mom, it's snowing!" And I couldn't really understand why he was so excited. So, I asked. And his answer that he gave would change my life forever. He said, "Mommy, it's snowing. I can see the clean snow coming from the sky." Because remember, when we were in the basement, We could only see the snow after it hit the ground and when everybody had trampled on it. So it was dirty. We could only see dirty snow from the basement. Now I can see clean snow coming from the sky. And he said, and Mommy, look, the window is so big, I can see the sky. That conversation with my then 6-year-old not only changed my life forever, it taught me the real meaning of gratitude. And you know what? That all happened by the window of a New York City homeless shelter. That shelter, that was a time that I knew that my life, our lives, had changed for the better. That is when I knew that that flood that I could have seen as a disaster was actually a blessing in disguise. It was a heralding of a new season. That shelter sheltered us from the rain, from the snow, from the New York City heat. I actually designed my second fine jewelry collection in that shelter. My oldest son studied hard in that shelter. He studied so hard, he was awarded a full scholarship to a boarding high school in that shelter. We baked cookies, we played games in that shelter. We grew, we laughed, we loved in that shelter. And when it had given all that it could, after 8 months, 8 being the number of new beginnings, it blessed us with a place that we could call home. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.